Welcome back and welcome to AfterCLIMB. This is the part of the program where I talk about a specific area of our POS product. And today I'm going to do a deep dive into decoupling your pricing and your receiving. I'm going to show you shelf labels and the importance of that in this whole process, and then how to do receiving in this same part of the process to save time and money. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the PowerPoint portion, decoupling pricing from receiving. The very first thing that people ask is, well, does this apply to my store? And my answer to that is yes, it applies to all stores in the pharmacy world unless you don't have a front end. But if you have a front end and you're ordering from one of the drug wholesalers, then this applies to you. Here at RMS, we have EDI interfaces with all of the drug wholesalers, the three big majors and the regionals. No matter who you're getting your OTC HBAs from, if you're getting from a drug wholesaler, we can do price updates electronically with those drug wholesalers. So yes, it applies to you. Now we have pharmacies that are of all sizes. So some of you have hundreds of vendors. This applies for the drug wholesalers. It may or may not apply for some of your other wholesalers, and I'll talk about that again here in a moment. Let's look at the history of this. How did this come about? Why are they coupled? Well, before POS and even today, the drug wholesalers send your product in totes, and in those totes, they send the item stickers to be able to sticker the items. Now, if you've turned that feature off, if they're not doing that anymore, you're not getting that. But many of you, even though you have POS, are still getting the item stickers with the totes. And historically, what people did prior to POS, and some of you are still doing it now, is you take the sticker, put it on the item, put that into a basket, do that for everything that's in the tote, and then when you're done, you should have no more stickers left and no more items in the tote. And if you do have an extra sticker, you were shorted. So that's the way it was. So they were naturally tied together, right? At the time you were receiving, you were stickering, and then for many of you that are still doing this, at that point you scan the item to see if the price is right. So I'm going to talk about why you shouldn't be doing that anymore. So now, as I said, this isn't one size fits all. So some of you have a lot of vendors besides the drug wholesaler. So for those vendors that you have, some of them can provide you price update files like in an Excel format or something like that, where we can use universal import, or you can use universal import to import those price changes on a periodic basis. And then other vendors, especially if you're doing, if you're doing things like gifts and things, don't have files at all. And so in those cases, you really don't have a choice. When you check in the item, you're going to have to receive it, and you're going to have to update the price, and in some cases, create the item. So again, not a one size fits all. Today, I want to really focus my attention on what virtually all of you, the vast majority of you, can and should be doing. So one of the things that you'll need to do to decouple is to be doing shelf labels. So many of you don't have the shelf label program, and that's something you should consider adding if you're interested in doing what I'm talking about, because there's going to be a big time saver. And that's an important piece of this part. And then others of you have the shelf label program, but today you're going to learn some things that you may not know that can help make this easier and faster. So let's get into talking about shelf labels. The first thing I want to talk about with shelf labels is that, like every other aspect of the system, a high quality database makes a big difference. So you want to be, the very first thing, and I talk about this in many of my previous AfterCLIMB discussions, is that it all starts with a good database, and keeping that database current, keeping it up to date, making sure that different fields of information are always there. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time or any time really showing you how to do that, but it's important, and it just makes things easier. And I have talked about it in the past, and I'll be talking about it in the future as well. Batch versus real-time processing of your price updates. there's a business decision to make here. If you have a really small front end and you're only, when you process a price update file, you're only talking about 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, even 100 items, and it only takes you a half an hour or so to put the new shelf labels out, then you may just process real time, just put them out, and recognizing that for that short period of time that you've approved, that you've processed the file, until you get the shelf labels out, that there's this pricing discrepancy, but it's a very small period of time. Now, for those of you with a larger front end, you may choose, and what I consider to be the best practice, especially for large front ends, is to batch process. That means when you process the price update file, you tell it to go to a batch, and you actually have to approve the batch with a date and time for all of the prices to take effect. So maybe you process the batch today, you're short staffed today, you can't possibly put shelf labels up today. So you say, I'm going to wait until tomorrow before the store opens for the new batch, for the new prices to take effect. And then tomorrow morning, you put up the shelf labels, or 2 days from now, or whenever you are going to have staffing. Okay. And then finally, I want to point out that once you have all of the setup done, this is crazy easy. And so I'm going to get into the demo now, and my system is set up correctly. And so I'm going to go through just like I would if I was operating a store and show you just how fast and simple this is. Then I'm going to back up and I'm going to show you how to set up each step of the way to make sure that yours is set up correctly so that you can experience the same crazy easy experience that I'm going to show you. Okay, so let's get right into the demo. So the first place I'm going to start is in the label program. Now, I have to simulate vendor EDI because I can't connect to a drug wholesaler. So I took the liberty of processing a price update file before this demo this morning and processing it to a batch. Now, your options are to process to a batch or to process it real time. And I've already addressed that. So I'm going to start with processing it to a batch. So now I'm going to do the next step after I process to a batch. And that step for me is just go straight to the label program. So I'm going to go into the label program. My label program is set up, defaulted the way I want it. I'm going to go load items. I'm going to go from a batch. I'm going to choose the batch. Here's my batch. You'll note that the batch is supposed to take effect. I've set it already to take effect tomorrow at 8 a.m. I can change this to whatever time I want. Let's say that I know I'm short-staffed all week, so I don't want it to take effect until Monday at 8 a.m. And let's say that the store opens at 9. So I'm going to have it take effect just before the store opens. Now that doesn't preclude me, and by the way, then at this point you tell it whether it's approved or not. So you approve that, and that's an important point. It has to be approved at this point, and that means that at 8 o'clock on the 12th, the new prices will take effect. In the meantime, I can click OK here. And when I click OK here, it's going to load all of the items that are in that batch. So now I can print my shelf labels well in advance of the price taking effect. And they're sitting there so that Monday morning, they're already printed, and the person that's going to be responsible for putting them out can put them out. So basically, it just has to be put, in this case, it should be put out sometime after the store closes and before the store opens the day that it's going to take effect. Again, if it takes effect and you haven't gotten them all out, depending on the size of the store, the number of prices that change will really determine, obviously, how much time you'll have some prices that are a little bit out of whack. But the idea doing batches that you have all the new shelf labels up before the store opens again. Okay, and then the next step is simply just clicking print. The way this works is it'll tell you the number of sheets you're going to need. You can also tell the starting label position. So if you use the first 12 labels on a sheet, you can start it in label 13. It'll tell you if you need any more sheets. The other most important thing is this, skip inactive items. Okay, so the way our system works is that we bring in from the drug wholesalers their entire database. So, in often cases, 30,000 items. You maybe only carry 1,000 or a couple thousand of those items, or even a couple hundred of those items. When we load those items in, they're all loaded to inactive. And the way our system works is if you sell an item that's inactive, it activates the item. If you um, receive an item that's inactive, it activates the item. And if you count, in inventory counting, an item that's inactive, it activates the item. So any item that you've actually carried is going to be active. So at this point, by telling it you're skipping inactive items, let's say that you have an entire 30,000 item file from your drug wholesaler. They have a price increase on 2,000 of those 30,000 items. When you process the price update file, it'll increase the price on all 2,000 items. But let's say you only carry 200 of those 2,000 items. When you go to print here by simply saying skip inactive items, you're only going to get the 200 items that you actually carry. So I simply say OK to this. It asks me if the label's printed correctly. I'll say yes. And I'm just going to show you the PDF. I had it print to a PDF so I can show you a sample of the labels. So I've blown these up so you can see it a little better. So in my label format, I've got the description, the barcode, the UPC number. This is the bin location. I'm using bin locations. I talked about that in my previous AfterCLIMB, and we recommend that, especially in larger pharmacies, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I've got the vendor, the reorder number from the vendor, and the price. Okay, and so that's a sample of a label. We can do all kinds of formats. You're not tied to any specific format, so there's a lot of power to this. Okay, so now, and that's it. It's simply do that, and now you can put the new shelf labels up, and you're done. Now let's just back up for a few minutes and go through the process. So I'm going to get out of the label program and kind of show you some of the setup here. And the first thing that I want to show on the setup is the batch and label queue editor. So the batch and label queue editor lets you choose what fields in the price update file and the pricing file will result in a new label being printed or it getting put into the batch. Now, I've chosen for my example that the only field I'm interested in is if the retail changes, then I want it to go to the label queue and I want it to go to a batch. No other field is going to make it change. So in other words, if the cost changes but the retail doesn't change, then I don't feel any need to print a new shelf label. In my case, I'm not even showing the cost on the shelf label, so it doesn't make any sense in my mind. Others, you could look at description. If the description changes, do you want it to print a new shelf label? Maybe. I don't have that set up, but that's just that this is a one-time setup, and you can decide the things that you want to have cause a new shelf label to print. Okay, so that's the first setup piece. The next, looking at the batch editor itself, this is you can review the batch here, and you can review the details of what's in the batch. So you can see each line item in the batch. You can see the current value and what it's going to change to. If you've got a couple thousand items in here, you're certainly not going to want to scroll through them. So this is, from a practical standpoint, is not something that you typically were going to do, but you can, and you can even delete items from the batch if you'd like to do that. But this is also another place that you can come in and set the effective date that you want and then also approve it. But you can do that from the label program. And then we're going to go back into the label program and show you some things in the label program. I'm willing to bet you that many of you, when you look at your label program, have a bunch of other columns of labels that you don't use. So let's start with where you set that up. And that's actually in the format. So if you go to format, there's a list of the formats here, and you'll notice that there's a field called display label. If you say no to that, then it won't display in the grid. That's all this means, is that you want it to display in the grid or not. So some of you may have a couple of different labels, especially if you're using shelf talkers. So as an example, This is a shelf talker. I don't have it in my grid right now, but if I wanted it in my grid, then I would just say yes here, and I'll go ahead and do it. And it'll now show me a sample of it, but if I cancel out, you'll see that now it's in my grid over here. Okay, so if you're just using one label though, then just get rid of all those others so that it doesn't, that it doesn't show up. The other thing that many of you probably don't know is that this quantity has a default as well. So in that case, we go back to the main menu. And if I go over to master parameters, which is under till apps and parameters, and I scroll up to labels, so my system acts a little bit slow when I'm doing these Zoom meetings. So just give me a sec here. Okay, then we'll go to labels, and then the default label quantity field. I set it to 1 here, and that's all you have to do. Okay, so that's just one field you don't have to worry about if you have that set. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and load the items again because I want to show you a couple of features. So I can load it. So the batch still exists because the batch is going to stay here until the price changes take effect. Okay, so we have this grid. So how does the system decide what order to print these items? Well, that's all determined over here. So if I go and say, for those of you that use bin locations, which is something I've talked about in one of the previous AfterCLIMBs and something we recommend and teach, then if you click by bin location, you'll notice that it sorts by bin location. So here are all the items in bin location 0101, then down to 0102, then 0103, and then WN01. Okay, now let's say I don't use bin locations, but I do use find lines. So you could come here and buy find line, and now you'll see all the find lines again in order. If you don't use find lines and use categories or departments, the same thing. You can just say department, and now it's going to sort by department. And it prints in this order that it's listed on the screen. So this can save you a lot of time by simply taking this one extra step of putting it in a certain order so that it prints those shelf labels in that order. Now, another tool you can use, and this is dependent on the size of the file. So if you only have like a small group of items like I have here, then you just print it all at once. But let's say that you have a huge front end and you have 500 or 600 or 1,000 prices that changed. Then it may, and you're going to have, let's say you're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 people going out and doing this all at the same time. Then it may make sense for you to use one of these two options here, print items by bin location. You definitely use that if you're using bin location, or print items by classification if you're not using bin location, but you're using find line, department, or category. They work exactly the same way, and I'm going to choose this first one. I'm going to choose the second one by classification. Okay, so now when I click print, I'll say by department, choose the department I want to print, click next, tells me the number of labels again, I click OK. It's going to print, I'm going to have it print to this PDF. Just right over right here. Now when I say OK, it's going to clear the grid except for in my case, the 2 items that are in a different department. So again, we're going to only do this if we had hundreds and hundreds of items. In my case, we just have a small group, but it clears that grid. Then you come back, choose the next department, or if you want to do multiple I did find lines there, remove all, go back to the department. If I wanted to do, one department, it would clear that department. I'll do both. And you just keep doing this until you've cleared all your departments. Okay, and again, that last feature, you're only doing that if you have a lot of items. Okay, so that deals with the shelf label program and how it works. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm just really going to talk about it, is receiving. So for those of you who are doing any kind of inventory control, so you're not, not doing on-hand quantities, then when you get those totes in from your drug wholesaler, one of the things, if you're still stickering the items, we've just talked about moving to shelf labels. The amount of time and labor that's spent on stickering items, checking the items in, is quite expensive over the course of a year. I would recommend to all pharmacies that you stop doing that. So when the items come in the tote, you simply put the items out on the shelf. Now you can do that if you're not having to sticker anymore because you have shelf labels. If you're doing inventory control, I still think you should do the same thing. Here's why. And you can check this yourself, and I recommend you do because it's a business decision. How many dollars in shorts have you filed claims against the wholesaler for over the course of the past year? You're going to find that you haven't filed, in many cases, you haven't filed any claims for shorts on OTCs. And if you have filed shorts, the dollar amount of shorts you filed is very, very small compared to the amount of labor you've spent checking the items in. So the best practice, just put the totes out. You have your shelf labels with the prices. The prices are getting updated either monthly or weekly, whatever you've chosen. The product comes in, you put it on the shelf. Now, if you're doing on-hand quantities, you can still do the same thing with a couple of thoughts about this. Yes, they may short you, and that means that particular item is going to be off on inventory. But inventory is never perfect. Even in a perpetual inventory world, it's never perfect because it can't be. People steal, things get broken, things don't get received properly. Whatever it is, they're going to be off a little bit, and that's what you do perpetual inventory for, is to catch those things. But again, we've already said that the drug wholesalers don't make a lot of picking errors when it comes to OTCs. So we set that aside. Now, the EDI program has abilities doing purchase order acknowledgments, which anything that they know they're not going to ship, when you process the purchase order acknowledgement, it zeroes that out of the purchase order. So now it's only the things that they're planning on shipping. We do that with all of the drug wholesalers. So that gets your purchase order almost completely accurate. But then some things they don't know that they're out of, or they had to substitute. So we also do with AmerisourceBergen the invoice, processing the invoice, which is exactly what they're billing you. In the case of AmerisourceBergen, what happens there with the purchase order is it zeroes out anything that they didn't ship, and it adds anything that they've added, whether it's substituted. Now we are going to do that with the other drug wholesalers as well. I don't have a timeline on that, but that does work with AmerisourceBergen. For the others, McKesson and Cardinal and the regionals, you may have to take your invoice and simply manually look at the difference. Like if they've substituted something, may have to add that manually, or if they're out of something, you may have to remove that. But the time savings is still immense in that situation. So those are some thoughts. Again, you have to make a business decision based on your exact situation. I'm going to open it up to questions now, and then feel free to contact us if you have questions later as well. Okay, and thanks everybody for joining me for AfterCLIMB, and I look forward to being here again next month. But like I said, I'm going to stick around here for a little bit and answer any questions you have. Have a great day.